She wore the black silk because she was finished. Finished with trembling. Finished with the cold silence of the Markus estate. Finished with pretending that her spirit hadn't been systematically dismantled over 3 long years. "In 48 hours, I will be a widow," Justina whispered to the empty, shadowed hallway, her voice steady, brittle, and terrifyingly free. She expected the house to exhale with her. She expected the heavy air of tyranny to lift. But as the words left her lips, the physician's door creaked open. The relief she had prepared for died in her throat, like a bird hitting a glass pane. A letter was thrust into her hand, not a medical bill, but a confession sealed in blood-red wax. The world narrowed to the parchment in her grip. Alexander was not just dying, he was vanishing on purpose. The master suite of Markus Manor was a tomb of velvet and mahogany. Golden sunlight fought through the heavy drapes, casting long, sickly fingers across the Persian rug. Outside, the world went on. Carriages rattled over cobblestones and the gardener clipped the hedges with rhythmic, indifferent snaps. But Justina felt none of it. She stood frozen at the edge of the massive 4-poster bed, her fingers white-knuckled around the sealed envelope. Her heart thudded once, a dull ache, then again. The man lying before her was the source of every nightmare she'd had since her wedding day. Alexander Markus, the tyrant, the stone, the man who had forbidden her friends and locked her behind gilded gates. He lay there now in a loose white shirt, his chest barely rising, his sharp jaw softened by the encroaching shadows of death. He was finally, mercifully silent. And yet, as she looked at the letter, the silence felt less like peace and more like a trap. The heavy oak door clicked shut, the sound echoing through the sterile silence of the master suite like the first spade of dirt hitting a coffin. Dr. Eris had not looked her in the eye. He had merely adjusted his spectacles, murmured something about comfort in the final hours, and fled. 48 hours. Justina stood at the edge of the massive 4-poster bed, her black silk skirts pooling around her feet like an ink blot on the ornate Persian rug. She looked down at Alexander. The man who had been her shadow, her jailer, and her husband for 3 years was reduced to a rhythmic, shallow wheeze. His skin, usually the color of weathered parchment, was now a translucent, ghostly white. His hands that had signed orders to lock the estate gates and restrict her every movement, lay open and vulnerable atop the velvet duvet. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they hovered over his cooling brow. She had prayed for this moment. She had rehearsed the relief she would feel when the tyrant of Markus Manor finally let go. But as she touched his skin, she felt only a hollow, jagged ache. "You're leaving me with nothing but ghosts, Alexander," she whispered. As she leaned down to adjust his pillow, an old habit of a wife who had learned to be a servant to his moods, her hand brushed against something hard and sharp tucked beneath the linen. It wasn't the cold steel of a pistol or the glass of a medicine vial. It was paper. Justina pulled it out slowly. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope, heavy with the weight of a secret. On the back, a glob of deep crimson wax sat like a fresh wound, stamped with the Markus crest. In Alexander's jagged, unmistakable script, 3 words were written across the front. "To my widow." Her heart thudded against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. She wasn't a widow yet. He was still breathing, still tethered to the world by a thread of failing silver. But why hide a message in the place where he laid his head every night? She fumbled with the seal, her breath catching as the wax snapped. Inside, the parchment was stained, as if it had been carried close to a sweating body for weeks. "Justina," the letter began, the ink slanted and hurried. "If you are reading this, the clock has started. You think I am dying of a broken heart or a failing constitution. You think I am the villain of your story. I have let you believe it because a hated wife is a neglected target. But I'm not sick, my love. I am being erased." Justina's eyes blurred. She looked from the letter to the dying man, then back again. A movement in the corner of her eye made her freeze. In the dim light of the hallway, a silhouette stood framed in the doorway, stationary, silent, and watching. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Alexander wasn't the one she should have been afraid of. The wax snapped under her thumb, A brittle sound that felt like the breaking of a bone. Justina's fingers shook as she smoothed the parchment, her eyes darting between the dying man on the bed and the jagged, hurried ink that seemed to pulse with a life he was losing. If you are reading this, I am already a ghost. For 3 years, I have played the tyrant. I forbade you the gardens, I severed your ties to the city, and I let you believe my heart was made of the same cold stone as these walls. I needed you to hate me, Justina. I needed the world to see you as my victim, for only a woman ignored by her husband is safe from his enemies. A single tear escaped, hot and stinging, trailing down her cheek to land on the word safe. She looked at Alexander's still form. The iron-fisted control she had loathed, the locked gates, the intercepted mail, the cancelled galas, hadn't been a cage. They had been a fortress. The Markus name carries a debt I inherited but could not pay. A cabal of men, hidden behind the respectable masks of the board, demanded your life as collateral for my defiance. I could not kill them all without making you a target. So I chose a slower path. For 6 months, I have allowed them to think they succeeded. I have been drinking their gifts, a vintage port laced with the essence of nightshade. Justina's breath hitched. She remembered the nights he had sat alone in his study, nursing a glass of dark wine, his face drawn and weary. She had thought him a drunkard, hiding from the wife he despised. Instead, he had been committing a slow, methodical suicide. I microdosed their poison to build a case. Every bout of illness, every collapse, was documented by Dr. Eris, the only man I trust. My death is the final evidence. Within 48 hours of my passing, the crown will receive a dossier that will hang every member of the cabal. My life for your permanent peace. It is a trade I made gladly. The weight of the sacrifice crushed the air from her lungs. He wasn't dying of a disease, he was dying of a choice. A choice made to protect a woman who had spent every night of the last 3 years wishing for his end. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Justina snapped her head toward the door. The shadowy silhouette was gone, but the heavy sense of being hunted remained. The letter trembled in her hand as she read the final, frantic line. Do not seek a cure. To save me is to alert them. Let me go, Justina. Be free. She looked at the clock on the mantel. 47 hours remained. Her cruel husband lay there, sacrificing his last heartbeats to buy her a future, but Justina felt a new, fierce heat rising in her chest. She had wanted freedom, but not at the cost of the only man who had ever truly loved her. The letter felt like a brand against her palm. Justina shoved the parchment deep into the pocket of her black silk dress just as a floorboard groaned outside the heavy oak doors. She turned, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The silhouette was no longer a static shadow in the distance. It was a presence, leaning into the sliver of light from the hallway. Justina forced her features into the mask she had worn for 3 years, the expression of a weary, dutiful wife waiting for the end of a nightmare. Who is there? She called out, her voice intentionally thin and brittle. The door creaked further open, and Mrs. Gable, the head housekeeper, stepped into the dim amber glow of the bedside lamps. The woman's face was a map of severe lines, her hands clasped tightly over her white apron. She had been the one to serve Alexander his evening port for months. She had been the silent witness to every argument and every cold dismissal. I thought I heard a cry, my lady, Mrs. Gable murmured, her small, dark eyes darting toward the bed, then toward Justina's hands. The doctor said he shouldn't be disturbed. He isn't disturbed, Gable. He is simply fading, Justina replied, moving to stand between the housekeeper and the pillow where the letter had been hidden. The air in the room felt thick, charged with a new and terrifying electricity. If Alexander was right, if he was being erased, then every person in this house was a potential architect of his demise. Was Gable the one lacing the wine? Or was she merely the one watching to ensure the poison took hold? I shall bring up some tea for you, my lady. It will be a long night, the housekeeper said, her tone flat and unreadable. No, Justina snapped, perhaps too quickly. She softened her voice, forcing a tired smile. I want nothing. I wish to be alone with my husband. Mrs. Gable lingered for a heartbeat too long, her gaze lingering on the rumpled linens of the bed. Finally, she curtsied and withdrew, the heavy click of the door sounding like a final warning. Justina didn't move until she heard the retreating footsteps fade down the carpeted hall. She turned back to the bed, dropping to her knees. She didn't have 47 hours. She had as long as she could maintain the facade of a grieving widow. Do not seek a cure, the letter had warned. To save me is to alert them. But Alexander had underestimated the woman he had spent 3 years trying to break. He had given her a cage to make her safe, but in doing so, he had taught her how to live in the dark. Justina reached under the bed, her fingers searching for the small, concealed latch Alexander thought she didn't know about. If the dossier existed, the proof that would hang the cabal, it wasn't just his evidence. It was his heartbeat. And she wasn't going to let it stop. The mantel clock struck 4 in the morning, a cold, metallic sound that seemed to slice through the heavy velvet of the room. 36 hours remained. Justina had not moved from the armchair beside the bed, her black silk dress rustling with every shallow breath she drew. The air in the room had grown thin, smelling of lavender and the sharp, medicinal tang of the nightshade that was systematically shutting down Alexander's heart. Suddenly, a ragged gasp broke the silence. Alexander's hand, previously as still as marble, jerked against the duvet. His head thrashed once to the side, and his eyes snapped open. They were not the eyes of the tyrant she had feared, clouded with calculated malice, but the eyes of a man drowning in his own skin. Justina, he wheezed, the name catching in a throat constricted by poison. She was at his side in an instant, her fingers lacing through his. "I'm here, Alexander. I'm right here." He looked at her, and for the first time in 3 years, the mask of the cold duke-like master was gone. His gaze fell to her pocket, where the silhouette of the letter pressed against the silk. A flash of pure, unadulterated terror crossed his face. "You found it," he whispered, his voice a ghost of its former authority. "Why aren't you running?" "Because you lied to me," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fury and devastating grief. "You made me hate you to keep me alive. Did you think I was so weak that I couldn't stand beside you?" Alexander's grip tightened with a final, desperate strength. He pulled her closer, his breath smelling of the bitter almonds of his sacrifice. "It wasn't just the cabal," he coughed, a thin trail of dark blood staining his lip. "The shadow, in the door. It's not a servant, Justina. It's your father." The world tilted. The enemy was not a nameless board of directors, but the very man who had sold her to Alexander 3 years ago. "He needs the dossier," Alexander gasped, his eyes beginning to roll back as the brief window of consciousness began to close. "He thinks, I have it. If he finds it, he'll kill you to hide his part in the poison." His hand went limp, slipping from hers and thudding onto the mattress. The rhythmic, shallow wheeze returned, heavier than before. Justina stood slowly, her fair skin ghastly in the flickering candlelight. The man she had spent years wishing dead had just handed her the ultimate betrayal and the ultimate choice. Her father was the wolf at the door, and Alexander was the only shield she had left. She looked at the clock. The 36-hour mark was passing. She couldn't just find the dossier anymore. She had to find the antidote, or she would be the next one erased. The candle in Justina's hand flickered, casting her shadow against the wall like a towering, distorted specter. She left Alexander's side, the rustle of her black silk dress sounding like a warning in the hollow quiet of the manor. 34 hours. She bypassed the main staircase, knowing the watcher would be stationed in the gallery. Instead, she slipped through a servant's passage, her fingers tracing the cold dampness of the stone until she reached a heavy, unmarked door at the end of the east wing. This was Alexander's private laboratory, the room she had been forbidden to enter under penalty of exile. She turned the brass handle. It was locked. Justina didn't hesitate. She reached into her hair, pulling out a long, silver pin from her elegant bun. Her brown hair spilled over her shoulders in a wild, unrefined wave, mirroring the desperation in her chest. She had watched The Locksmith once, years ago, and she had spent 3 years learning how to survive a man who kept everything under lock and key. With a sharp click, the mechanism gave way. The room smelled of sulfur, dried herbs, and the metallic tang of copper. Glass beakers and iron crucibles lined the shelves, glinting like bared teeth in the candlelight. Justina moved to the central desk, her eyes scanning the neat rows of leather-bound journals. She found it near the back, a small, blue vial labeled with a single, chilling word, aconite. Beside it sat a smaller, clear bottle, nearly empty. The essence of nightshade. "You were documenting your own murder," she whispered, her voice cracking. She pulled a drawer open and there it was, the dossier. It was thick, stuffed with bank receipts, signed letters from her father, and the chemical formulas for the toxins Alexander had been forced to ingest. But as she reached for the evidence, her hand brushed a hidden compartment. Inside lay a small, crystalline jar filled with a thick, golden syrup. The antidote. Justina's heart leapt. She grabbed the jar, the glass cool and smooth against her palm. This was the miracle. This was the 48th hour given back to them. But as she turned to leave, the light from the hallway was suddenly blocked. A tall, familiar silhouette stood in the doorway. It wasn't the hunched form of a servant. It was a man in a tailored frock coat, his face obscured by the darkness, his cane tapping rhythmically against the floorboards. "Justina, my dear," her father's voice oiled through the room. "You always were too curious for your own good. I told Alexander that a wife should be kept in the dark. Now, be a good girl and hand me that jar." The stakes were no longer just Alexander's life. The antidote in her hand was the only thing standing between Justina and the man who had authored her husband's death. Justina stood paralyzed, the golden jar of the antidote pressing into her palm like a pulse. Her father, Lord Hale, stepped fully into the laboratory's flickering light. He looked exactly as he always had, refined, silver-haired, and possessed of a calm that Justina now realized was the chilling stillness of a predator. "I expected you to be weeping at his bedside, Justina. That would have been the proper, quiet end to this," he said, his cane clicking against the stone floor. "Give me the jar. Alexander has already served his purpose. His death is the only thing that keeps our family name from the gallows." "Our family name?" Justina's voice was a low, dangerous thrum. She took a step back, her hips brushing the workbench where the lethal aconite sat. "You didn't sell me to a tyrant to protect me. You sold me to a man you thought you could control, and when he started collecting evidence against you, you decided to erase him." Her father's eyes thinned. He was a fool. He thought he could outplay the board. "Now the jar, Justina. Don't make me call the guards. You know how they fear Alexander's madness. They'll believe you finally snapped under the strain." Justina looked at the doorway. Behind her father, the shadowy silhouette appeared again, Mrs. Gable. The housekeeper didn't move to help him. She stood with her arms folded, her expression as unreadable as the stone walls. Justina's mind raced through the 3 years of lessons Alexander had forced upon her. A hated wife is a neglected target. He had taught her to be invisible. He had taught her that men like her father only looked at what they expected to see. "You're right, father," she whispered, her shoulders sagging in a practiced show of defeat. She held the golden jar out, her fingers trembling. "I can't do this. I'm just tired of the secrets." Lord Hale smiled, a thin, triumphant curve of the lips. He reached for the antidote, his greed masking his caution. The moment his fingers touched the glass, Justina didn't let go. Instead, she pivoted, using his own momentum to pull him toward the workbench. With her free hand, she grabbed the open bottle of bitter nightshade and threw the contents directly into his eyes. He screamed, a high, ragged sound of agony, dropping his cane as he clawed at his face. Justina didn't wait. She bolted for the door, expecting Mrs. Gable to tackle her. Instead, the housekeeper stepped aside, her dark eyes meeting Justina's for a fleeting second. "Go, my lady," Gable whispered. "He's been dying for 6 months. Don't let him wait another hour." Justina sprinted down the servants' passage, her black silk skirts tearing against the rough stone. She had the antidote. She had the dossier. But as she reached the master suite, the clock on the mantel began to chime. 32 hours remained, but Alexander's breathing had stopped. The silence in the master suite was more terrifying than her father's screams. Justina slammed the oak doors shut, bolting them with a strength born of pure, unadulterated panic. She lunged for the bedside, her knees hitting the floor with a bone-jarring thud. Alexander was as still as a fallen statue. His chest, once a rhythmic reminder of his survival, was a flat, unmoving expanse of white linen. The 32 hours he had promised her had been stolen by the stress of the confrontation. "Not like this," she sobbed, her fingers fumbling with the cork of the golden jar. "You don't get to leave me with a confession and a corpse, Alexander. Wake up." She tilted his head back, her hand shaking so violently that the golden syrup coated her knuckles. She pressed the rim of the jar to his blue-tinged lips, but they were sealed shut, locked by the final tremors of the nightshade. Desperation clawed at her throat. She remembered a fragment of a conversation she had overheard between Alexander and the physician months ago, something about the blood and the heart's transit. Justina grabbed the small, silver fruit knife from the refreshment tray. With a jagged breath, she pressed the blade against the palm of her own hand, slicing a thin red line across her skin. The pain was sharp, grounding her. She then did the unthinkable. She smeared the golden antidote into her own open wound before pressing her bleeding palm firmly against Alexander's mouth and nostrils, forcing her own oxygen and the infused medicine into his system through sheer physical proximity and a frantic, sobbing kiss. "Breathe," she commanded, her forehead pressed against his. "Breathe for me, you stubborn, selfless fool." Seconds stretched into an eternity. The clock on the mantel ticked, mocking, rhythmic, indifferent. Then a spasm. Alexander's body lurched beneath her. A ragged, wet sound tore from his lungs. A cough that sprayed dark, tainted blood across her black silk bodice. His eyes flew open, bloodshot and wild, staring at her with a terrifying intensity. He gasped for air, his fingers digging into her shoulders, anchoring himself to the living world. "Justina," he croaked, his voice a jagged ruin. "I have the antidote," she whispered, her tears washing the blood from her cheeks. "And I have the dossier. My father is in the lab, blinded and broken. The Watcher is on our side." Alexander looked at her, really looked at her, and the tyrant vanished completely. In his eyes was a raw, vulnerable pride. He reached up with a trembling hand, touching the smear of blood on her cheek. "I told you to be free," he wheezed. "I am free," she replied, her voice hardening with a new, lethal strength. "And now we're going to make sure they never touch us again." The dawn was a bruised purple against the horizon when the sound of heavy hooves thundered up the manor's gravel drive. 30 hours remained on the physician's clock, but the air in the master suite had shifted from the stagnant scent of death to the sharp, electric tang of a battlefield. Alexander sat propped against the pillows, his face still ghostly but his eyes, those dark, piercing flint-gray eyes, were alert. Justina sat on the edge of the mattress, her black silk dress stained with his blood and her own, the golden jar empty on the nightstand. Between them lay the dossier, its corners curled and its contents laid bare. "They are here," Alexander rasped, his hand finding hers. His grip was weak, but the intent was absolute. The Royal Constabulary. Eris must have sent word the moment the toxin peaked. A heavy pounding echoed from the front doors below, followed by the shouting of men. Justina stood, smoothing her ruined skirts. She felt a strange, cold calm. The delicate features her father had once mocked were now set in a mask of iron. "Wait," Alexander commanded, his voice gaining a sliver of its old authority. "The shadow, Justina. My study. The floorboard near the hearth." Before she could ask, the bedroom door swung open. It wasn't the police. It was the background figure, Mrs. Gable, but she wasn't alone. She was flanking a man in a high-collared navy coat, his silver badge glinting in the candlelight. "Lady Markus," the officer began, his eyes taking in the blood and the disheveled room. "We received a report of a poisoning. We found Lord Hale in the East Wing. He is calling for your arrest." Justina didn't flinch. She picked up the dossier and walked toward the officer with a slow, deliberate grace. My father is a blind man screaming in the dark, Inspector. He is the architect of a murder that failed. She handed him the papers, the bank receipts, the correspondence with the cabal, and the chemical analysis of the nightshade. My husband microdosed a death sentence to ensure these men could never threaten the crown, or me, again. Everything you need to hang the board is in your hands. The officer's eyes widened as he flipped through the pages. Behind him, Mrs. Gable dipped a silent, respectful curtsy to Justina. The Watcher had not been a spy for the enemy, but the final failsafe Alexander had put in place to protect his wife if he couldn't wake up. And the Duke? The inspector asked, looking toward the bed. The Duke is recovering, Justina said, her voice ringing through the room. And he is no longer acting alone. Alexander watched her, a faint, ghost-like smile touching his lips. The tyrant was dead, buried under the weight of the truth. What remained was a man who had sacrificed everything for a woman who was now, for the first time, truly his equal. The morning sun finally broke through the heavy velvet drapes, no longer a sickly finger of light but a clear, persistent gold that washed over the room. The frantic ticking of the mantel clock had lost its power, the 48 hours had passed, and the silence that followed was not one of death, but of a profound, exhausted peace. Alexander sat by the window in a high-backed armchair, his white shirt open at the collar, his skin regaining a hint of its natural warmth. He looked toward the door as Justina entered. She had finally changed out of the stained black silk, appearing now in a gown of soft, dove gray. Her hair was pulled back, no longer in a severe bun, but falling in gentle waves that softened her tired features. My father has been taken to the tower, she said quietly, coming to stand beside him. The inspector found the ledgers he tried to burn. The cabal is falling apart like a house of cards. Alexander reached out, his hand steady as he took hers. He traced the small, healing line on her palm, the mark of the gamble she had taken to save him. I spent 3 years building a fortress to keep you in, he rasped, his voice still rough but no longer a ghost. I thought if I made myself the villain, you would never be implicated in my war. I was a fool to think I could protect you by erasing myself. Justina looked out over the estate. The iron gates were open. The guards were gone. For the first time, the manor didn't feel like a tomb, it felt like a home waiting to be lived in. You gave me safety, Alexander, but you denied me the truth, she said, turning her gaze back to him. I don't want a protector who hides in the shadows. I want a partner who stands in the light. He pulled her hand to his lips, pressing a lingering, reverent kiss to her knuckles. It wasn't the cold, measured gesture of a master, but a silent vow of a man who had been given a second life. The board is gone, he whispered. The debts are paid. There are no more secrets between us, Justina. Only the life we choose to build now. She leaned down, resting her forehead against his, closing her eyes as she felt the steady, strong beat of his heart against her own. The cruel husband was gone, and the exhausted wife had found her strength. In the dim sunlight of the new day, they weren't starting a marriage based on a contract or a sacrifice, but on a fragile, beautiful honesty. The beginning was finally hers to shape.